In the remote hollows of the Missouri Ozarks in 1892, the world felt smaller and darker. Forests stretched without end, and the nearest neighbor could be hours away on foot. It was here, in a hidden valley carved by stone and shadow, that twin sisters Clara and Lila lived with their father, in a house that looked ordinary from afar, but held a secret that would haunt the land for decades. Into this isolated world came a young man named Daniel, 17 years old, orphaned, alone, and unaware of what fate awaited him. Their father, a man of rigid belief and commanding presence, called Daniel Providence, insisting he was destined to preserve the family bloodline. Daniel was taken to the cellar beneath the house, where iron and wood kept him confined for years, silent and unseen, while the family's doctrines dictated the course of life and death. A child would be born. What followed for that infant would remain unspoken, a horror no one in the surrounding hollows could imagine. When the story finally emerged, it was too late to save any of them. Clara and Lila were gone, leaving behind a tale of obedience, fear, and devotion twisted beyond comprehension. This is the story of the Mountain Sisters and the lives bound and broken within their walls. Subscribe now and comment with your city and local time. Let's see where everyone is watching from. The Ozarks of Missouri were a world apart. Trees grew thick and ancient, their roots twisting through limestone ridges, and the hollows sank deep into the earth, hiding secrets in shadows and silence. Families here didn't merely live. They survived, shaped by winters that could trap a traveler for days, by rains that turned roads to rivers of mud, and by a world beyond the forest that seemed distant and untrustworthy. At the end of one such hollow sat the Barrow homestead, a modest log cabin with a stone chimney, a barn that leaned with age, and a root cellar dug deep into the hillside. From the outside, it appeared ordinary. Inside was a different story. Here lived Josiah Barrow, a man whose religious devotion had hardened into something commanding. His voice could speak of divine purpose and the sacredness of bloodlines with the certainty one might speak of the sunrise. His wife had died years before, leaving the family to a rhythm dictated by his presence and by the sisters, Clara and Lila, who moved like shadows within the house, quiet, precise, always together, their steps echoing in perfect harmony. Beyond the homestead, stories grew of the reclusive Silas Barrow, Josiah's brother, who lived deeper in the wilderness, alone. Hunters spoke of him only in low voices. Children were warned to stay away from the hollows, and townsfolk would nod politely when his name was mentioned, never asking questions they feared might demand answers. It was a place where isolation nurtured fear, where silence spoke louder than words, and where the coming of a young man named Daniel would set into motion events that no neighbor could imagine. A secret hidden in plain sight, beneath the calm surface of the Barrow home. In the spring of 1888, Daniel arrived at the Barrow homestead. At 17, he had just lost both parents to influenza within days of each other. Orphaned and uncertain, he carried only the clothes on his back, a small bundle of belongings, and a fragile hope that he might find a place to belong. The Barrows were his only living relatives willing to receive him. At first, life seemed manageable. Daniel helped carry supplies, swept floors, chopped wood, and fetched water from the nearby stream. The sisters moved around him with an eerie synchronicity, sometimes directing his work, sometimes silent for hours, their faces unreadable. Locals who glimpsed him walking with the twins noted the boy's nervous posture, the way his eyes darted toward the cabin, as if anticipating an unseen command. By autumn, Daniel ceased appearing in town altogether. When questioned, the sisters offered plausible explanations. Young men seeking work often ventured to Springfield or Kansas City, but no one could confirm his whereabouts. To the outside world, he had left. Inside the Barrow home, the truth was far more chilling. Hidden beneath the cabin, in the root cellar dug deep into the hillside, Daniel was confined. Iron chains bound him, and the space became both his prison and the stage for a doctrine the outside world could scarcely imagine. For Daniel, the forest that surrounded him was no longer a symbol of freedom. It was a wall, enclosing him in a reality dictated by his family's unyielding beliefs. Josiah Barrow had not always been confined to a bed. Years before, he had walked the hollows with strength and purpose. But by the time Daniel arrived, a stroke had left him partially paralyzed. His body was fragile, his movements slow, yet his mind remained sharp and unyielding. He called Daniel to his bedside in the late afternoons, when shadows crept across the wooden floorboards. There, Josiah spoke of providence, not as a general idea, but as a personal mandate, a divine instruction binding his family's actions to a plan unseen by the rest of the world. He told his daughters that Daniel had been sent for a purpose. He was not merely a relative in need of shelter. He was the instrument through which the Barrow line would endure, preserved from the corruption of the outside world. To Josiah, the purity of blood, the sanctity of lineage, and the obedience of his daughters were inseparable from his understanding of God's plan. When he declared that Daniel was to serve as a husband, not by law, but in the eyes of God, he framed it as an imperative that brooked no question. The sisters, raised entirely within this worldview, understood their father's voice as unquestionable authority. They had never been told to argue, to resist, or to consider alternatives. In their lives, obedience equaled righteousness, and doubt was the whisper of sin. It was after this declaration that the cellar assumed its grim purpose. Daniel was led down a narrow wooden staircase, into walls damp with moisture and air cool and heavy. Chains were fastened to secure him, not with cruelty for cruelty's sake, but with the chilling conviction that this was necessary, an act of obedience and divine order. For years, he would remain there, removed from sight and speech, his world reduced to the limited space of the cellar, punctuated by the footsteps of the sisters who brought him food, water, and the role he was meant to fulfill. Outside, the forest continued its slow rhythm, indifferent to the suffering below. Seasons changed, storms passed, snow blanketed the hollows in silence, and neighbors went about their lives, unaware of the prison hidden beneath the Barrow home. By 1896, years had passed since Daniel had been confined to the cellar, and the small town of Forsyth, Missouri, remained largely unaware of the darkness in the hollows beyond. But news traveled slowly, and sometimes the world beyond the forest reached even the most isolated places. It came in the form of a letter addressed to Sheriff Reuben Galloway, a former Union Army tracker who had served as sheriff in Taney County for 15 years. The letter was from a woman named Martha Hendris in Illinois. She identified herself as Daniel's aunt and explained that she had written to her nephew over the years, hoping for a reply, but none had ever come. She implored the sheriff to inquire after Daniel, to ensure his safety. Galloway could not ignore such a request. He began with the town. Storekeepers, farmers, and neighbors were polite but uninformative. They remembered the Barrow family. They remembered a young man who had come to live with them, and then he had disappeared. Their recollections were sparse. Daniel had left to seek work, perhaps traveled to Springfield, perhaps further. No one could say for certain. With no clear leads, Galloway resolved to visit the Barrow homestead himself. The journey was arduous. Miles of rolling hills and dense forest, giving way to narrower, overgrown paths. Every mile brought him deeper into isolation. By the time he arrived at the Barrow cabin, the sun was low, casting long shadows. The structure appeared well kept, smoke curling from the chimney. From the porch emerged two figures, Clara and Lila, identical in stance, in clothing, in expression. Their faces were calm, almost serene, yet every movement suggested caution. Galloway introduced himself and explained his purpose. He asked about Daniel. The sisters exchanged a brief glance. Then one spoke in a soft, yet deliberate voice, claiming that Daniel had left years before, restless to seek work elsewhere. She could not recall where exactly he had gone, and no one in the family had heard from him since. He asked if he might speak to Josiah. The sisters informed him that their father was gravely ill, confined to his room, unable to receive visitors. Questions about Daniel's possessions and last sightings were met with vague answers and deliberate omissions. Despite the apparent normalcy of their responses, Galloway's instincts told him something was amiss. The cabin radiated a quiet that was heavier than absence. Legally, he could do nothing. He had no warrant, no evidence of wrongdoing. Yet every fiber of his being suggested that this house held stories untold. He left that evening with more questions than answers, and the forest seemed to close behind him, swallowing the secrets of a family whose lives were bound as tightly as the chains in the cellar below. Months passed after Sheriff Galloway's visit, but the threads of truth have a way of revealing themselves, and in this case, it came through Dr. Edwin Cross, a physician who had spent more than 30 years traversing the Ozark wilderness to tend to the sick and injured in remote homesteads. In late summer, Dr. Cross visited Galloway quietly, almost hesitantly. He spoke of an event that had occurred 2 years prior, in 1894, at the Barrow homestead. He had been summoned under unusual circumstances, led blindfolded through the forest by one of the sisters. The urgency had been palpable, though no words conveyed the cause. When he arrived at the cabin, Dr. Cross found one of the twins in the final stages of labor. The situation was grave, requiring every ounce of his skill. Yet it was the secrecy surrounding it that unsettled him most. He was instructed clearly that nothing about the event could be spoken, that his silence was as necessary as the care he provided. After the child's delivery, he was quickly guided away, still blindfolded, paid in cash, and given strict instructions never to speak of what he had witnessed. The infant, he told Galloway, bore severe deformities. The doctor had seen enough to know that survival would be difficult, but he had not been permitted to provide prolonged care. The sister who remained with him was unwavering in her enforcement of secrecy. In the months that followed, Dr. Cross learned that the child had been removed entirely from view. Its cries had been heard once, faint and brief, then silence returned. Dr. Cross did not speculate openly on what had happened after he departed. His account left the sheriff with heavy questions. What had become of the child? Where was Daniel? And what had been taking place in the Barrow home all these years? In sharing this with Galloway, Dr. Cross brought the first concrete indication that the story of the Barrow family was far more than one of simple isolation. The sheriff understood he was no longer seeking a missing person. He was confronting a world governed by laws unknown to him, by a family whose reality had become entirely its own. In early September of 1896, news reached Forsyth of the death of Silas Barrow. the reclusive elder brother who had lived alone deep in the forest. A trapper had discovered him lifeless, apparently the victim of a timber rattlesnake bite, a common hazard in the Ozark wilderness. Yet for Sheriff Galloway, protocol demanded examination. He organized a small party, and they rode into the dense forest, following the trapper's directions. The cabin appeared suddenly, nestled among trees, crude and functional, a shelter against weather rather than comfort. Inside, the scene was as expected. Sparse furnishings, tools for survival, and Silas's body showing signs of the snakebite. But when the deputy began to circle the property, an unsettling discovery was made. A wooden cover obscuring the family well had been shifted. Fresh scrape marks ran along its edges, and a faint but unmistakable odor lingered in the air. The smell of decay. Galloway approached with caution. As the cover was removed, the darkness of the well seemed to pull at the men. At the bottom, partially submerged, was something large, clearly human in form. Rope and pulleys were fetched. Slowly, methodically, they drew the bundle upward. When the canvas fell away, 2 bodies became visible. Decomposition had advanced, but identification was unmistakable. The bodies were identical. The twin sisters, Clara and Lila, who had moved through town with quiet, deliberate gestures, now lay exposed to the daylight they had once avoided. As they searched further, a smaller bundle was found, wrapped carefully in oilcloth and sealed against moisture. When opened later in Galloway's office, it revealed a collection of papers in meticulous handwriting. A confession, a chronicle that would turn what appeared to be a natural death and a mysterious disappearance into a narrative of captivity, religious extremism, and tragic consequences. The letters found in the well changed everything. Sheriff Galloway, seated at his desk in fading afternoon light, read the pages with growing unease. In her own handwriting, one of the sisters described a reality entirely governed by the doctrine their father had instilled. He had taught them that their family was chosen, sanctified, and in need of absolute separation from the corrupting influence of the outside world. It was a belief that had grown extreme and unbreakable. According to the letters, Daniel's arrival was not coincidence, but divine orchestration. Their father had declared him Providence, the vessel through which the family line would be preserved. The letters detailed Daniel's confinement in the root cellar, treated as both vessel and prisoner, subject to the twins' unwavering adherence to their father's command. The sisters believed what they were doing was righteous, that obedience to their father's teachings superseded all morality or law. They documented their actions with clinical precision. What outsiders might see as cruelty, they saw as duty. Then came the birth. In 1894, with Dr. Cross's assistance, one sister delivered a child. The letters explained that the infant bore deformities so severe that the sisters interpreted them as signs of divine judgment. Within the confines of their isolated worldview, they decided the child's life could not continue. The infant was removed and buried in secrecy. Daniel, witnessing the event or learning of it, ceased to eat, ceased to speak, and soon died, his fate as obscured as the infant's burial. As Galloway continued reading, he understood the sisters' descent into fear. Silas, once distant, had become in their perception a supernatural observer, a punisher who threatened to expose their actions. They saw his presence everywhere, at the edge of the forest, in patterns of animal bones, in the slightest disruption of their homestead. Their reality became governed by terror, a constant vigilance that eroded any remaining semblance of normalcy. The letters culminated in the sisters' final decision. They wrote of walking to the well, knowing Silas was away, sealing their confession in meticulous detail, and choosing to end their lives together. Their last words were prayers, a plea for understanding, an attempt to frame their actions within the only truth they had ever known. By the time Galloway laid the letters down, the story had transformed. What began as curiosity about a missing young man had revealed a family enmeshed in delusion and fear, a sequence of events that left no one unscathed. Daniel, the infant, Josiah, Clara, and Lila, all gone, victims and perpetrators intertwined. With the letters read and the bodies examined, Sheriff Galloway faced the grim task of reconciling the horror he had uncovered with the limitations of law. The dead could not be brought to justice. The living were few and fearful. Galloway wrote to Martha Hendris in Illinois, explaining as gently as possible that her nephew was no longer alive. The letter spared her the most gruesome details, but it could not conceal the full scope of what had unfolded. The Barrow homestead itself became a place of uneasy memory. Abandoned, it fell into decay. Within a decade, the structure was burned to the ground, the circumstances never fully explained, leaving the hollows scarred and the root cellar destroyed. Locals whispered of the place as cursed. Stories of the twin sisters, of their father's strict doctrines, of the captive cousin, and the infant whose life was cut short, circulated quietly, passed from one generation to the next. The landscape of the Ozarks seemed to absorb the memory of the Barrow family. Hills and hollows, forests and ridges became a backdrop to a story that spoke not just of crime, but of isolation's capacity to shape human behavior, to warp perception, and to conceal acts the outside world might never fully comprehend. And so, the hollows remained, silent witnesses to a past the world could not easily touch. Some secrets were buried in earth, others in memory, and some within the shadows of human consciousness itself. The story of Clara, Lila, Daniel, and the Barrow family became a cautionary testament, a record of devotion turned to delusion, of faith transformed into justification, of isolation that allowed horror to flourish beyond the eyes of neighbors or authorities. For those who hear this story today, it is a reminder that darkness can take many forms, and that sometimes the most unsettling truths are the ones hidden in plain sight, where isolation and ideology combine to shape a reality entirely their own. If you've made it this far into the story, take a moment to let me know you're still here. Comment with your city and your local time. Let's see where everyone is watching from. And if you want more stories just like this one, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload.